Hello and welcome to Top Secret TV, the show that defies gravity. On tonight's show we've got our usual wonderful UFO man, George Simpson from Victorian UFO Research Society. He'll be telling us about the latest in sightings and also an amazing new book that's out on the market. So welcome George, how you going?
Yeah, good, thanks David.
Good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice
now,
we've got a couple of, not too many sightings, but there's been one or two since last time we spoke. Can you just tell us about the latest sighting involving lights that were quite far apart?
Yeah, it would have been a good one if I'd gone out in my own backyard that night, because I might have seen it myself if my timing had been right.
Yeah.
It was on the 5th of August. We got quite a few reports from people that they'd seen these lights going over. They were fairly large, fairly bright lights, but they were a great distance apart from one another. But they stayed in the same formation the whole time that they were observed. One lady actually videotaped the lights going over. And I went down and had a look at the videotape. Unfortunately, she'd only just recently bought the camera and was just sort of mucking around with it. And she was having a cigarette out in the backyard. It was about 9:30 in the evening when she saw the lights going over, so she grabbed the camera and started filming them. But it had autofocus, and the autofocus system didn't know what she was trying to do. And it just keeps going out of focus, and as soon as you look at the image and see something that as soon as you begin to look at it, it just went out of focus and just became a great big blurry blob on the screen. So it was really frustrating. There was one point where it stayed in focus for a little while and something fell, which appeared to be on fire as it fell. So it was like this flaming object coming down.
Really?
Yeah. A few other people reported seeing that. They were in the Bond Beach area. Apparently in the Patterson Lakes area, there's in McLeod Road, a lot of cars stopped. And people got out to watch this thing going over.
So it was pretty visible.
Yeah, it was very, very high, but the lights were kilometres apart, but they stayed in the same formation as they went over.
That's very unusual.
The lady that videotaped it said that it went out of sight behind some trees where they live, but other people who saw it after that said that as it went over the bay, it changed its formation. It made a few different patterns, a few different shapes and things. Would have been a good one to see.
Yeah, it would. So that obviously brings up an issue for all you budding ufologists out there. If you have a camera, turn off the autofocus. Is that true?
Yeah, if that's an option. Some of the new cameras don't have an off switch for the autofocus, which is a shame.
Yeah, it is. All right, now moving on to actually why we're here, which is this book, The Day After Roswell. Now I understand you got pretty excited about this book when it came out, that it raises quite a few important issues. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, well, it's the first time that somebody who was actually involved at the time, from the Army's point of view, somebody who actually worked at the Pentagon and was involved, was an advisor to the Kennedy administration as well. Colonel Philip J. Corso was, there's a photograph of him there on the back. He was actually an advisor to President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. So he was right there where the action was when it was happening.
When would this have been, in 1950?
That was in the 60s, no, when Kennedy was president.
Right.
But before that, in 47, he was actually in charge of an army base called Fort Riley. And that was at the actual time when Roswell occurred. And one of his duties, being in charge of that particular base, was at night time he had to make sure that all of the people on guard duty were at their post, and he'd have to go out and do rounds right throughout the night to make sure everybody was still, nobody had fallen asleep, that they were still there with their weapons and guarding whatever thing they had to guard for the night. And
so it was obviously of some importance.
Yeah, and he talks about in the book, he talks about how he was doing one of these patrols, and one of these guards wasn't at his post, and so he knew there was something up. You know, just something wasn't as it should be. And he said, "Where the hell are you?" And the voice came from inside the shed. Now apparently it was they still used horses in the army in 1947, and at Fort Riley they had a veterinary clinic there, and this was the veterinary clinic that was being guarded. And the guy wasn't at his post, and he'd gone inside, and he said, "Where are you?" And he heard from inside somebody saying, "You've got to come and see this, Colonel." And he went inside to have a look, he went crook at him for not being there. He told him, get outside and get on duty. You know? And then he had an armed guard at the door, so he could spend all the time he liked looking at what was in there. And there was a lot of crates stored in there. It was a temporary storage area. And he opened up one of these crates and he said there was an alien body in there, in a preservative fluid. And he was able to just look at it for as long as he liked.
Wow.
He was horrified and surprised and everything by it. He had a really good look at it for a long time, and at first he thought it was a child. And it was definitely a humanoid body.
Like radiation affected child or something?
Well, I don't know, but he said it had a large head, very, very, just small holes for a nose, no actual protuberance of it, just a flat sort of a small nose, small holes, and no real mouth or lips, just a slit, just like you hear of these reports of greys.
Even very much like the Santilli footage. Not that we're sure that that's legit.
We're not, but there's a lot of parallels. A lot of what Corso says seems to support the authenticity of that film to some degree.
Yeah. Does he comment on it in the book, actually?
No, he doesn't make any comment about the Santilli film at all. But some of the other things that he talks about in here are supportive of the film.
Now, one of the issues that we briefly touched on before we started taping was the idea that they took the technology from the crash and actually gave it to corporations of the time like IBM and said that it was from a foreign power or whatever, and used them to back engineer. Is that correct? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, after this thing that happened at Fort Riley, of course I just wanted to forget about it. He just wanted to put it out of his mind all entirely, and he didn't talk to anybody about it. But later on, about 14 years later, he was at the Pentagon. He had a top job there. He must have come up the ranks a little bit, you know. And his office was directly below the office of his boss, who was Major Trudeau. And while he was there, Trudeau said, that filing cabinet over there is going down to your office and you're looking after it. And that was taken downstairs with an armed guard.
Pretty important files.
Okay. And and he was told that it was his responsibility to look at it and try to work out what they were going to do. And just Trudeau and Corso, they were the only people in the entire Pentagon that knew what the contents of that filing cabinet were. And it was all the papers to do with the Roswell incident and bits and pieces of the extraterrestrial debris that was picked up.
Like chunks of metal and stuff?
All sorts of things that were supplied to them sort of as a package by Nathan Twining at the time. It had been sitting there in the Pentagon for 14 years and nothing had been done with it. And nobody knew it was there. And the CIA had heard about it and were trying to get into it. But they didn't know who had it or what it was. It was kept from the CIA, so the CIA never knew anything.
So it just sat there for 14 years?
Yep.
That's amazing.
And nobody knew what to do with it. And of course I was given the job of trying to decide, what will we do with this stuff? How are we going to even work it out? You know, it was foreign technology. Well, they called it foreign technology. It was alien technology. The first thing that they looked at was something that was picked up in the desert at the crash site, which the only way you could describe them would be using today's terminology, contact lenses that went right over your eye, and when you put them on, you could see in the night time. It gave you night vision.
Wow.
And so Corso found out which companies, like Sandy Laboratories or somebody, were trying to develop new weapons and things for the American Army. And so they actually, very sort of on the quiet, slipped these artefacts to the top scientists that were leading the research and said, look, this is they said this was foreign technology that we've got. Have a look at this, see what you can do with it. If you can develop this, we want to be able to use it for our guys. So you guys can take the credit for it. If you need any research dollars to help you with it, you know, we've got the entire government behind us, but we don't want any credit for it. You guys take the credit for it.
Gee,
so the companies themselves didn't know where this stuff came from.
Yeah.
They just developed it.
You've got a bit of a list there of some of the alleged technologies that we have today that are supposedly based on this?
Yeah, well, the fibre optics or image intensifiers that were used during the war in the Gulf.
So night
just
vision
recently,
goggles.
yeah. And one of the first things he talks about in the book is that at the crash site, it was 4:30 in the morning when they got there, and there was a big split in the side of this craft, and they looked inside it, and they thought they could see daylight, that they could see windows and light coming in through the windows. But it was still, pull your head out and have a look again, it's still night time, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
It was because the windows of the craft had this image intensifying equipment in the windows, so that whoever was flying the craft could just look outside even at night time and just see the details of what was down there.
And what are some of the other stuff?
Yeah, fibre optics. There was no wiring found in the craft at all. There was also there was no food storage area. There was none of the things you would normally associate with long distance travel. So they left them with the impression that this vehicle could either just get here in no time at all, they could just pop off back home if they wanted to
have a meal,
go and have a meal or something, or go to the toilet or whatever, you know, if they needed to do that.
There was no head?
Nothing there at all like that at all.
Really?
No supplies, no food supplies, no water, nothing. One thing that they found, which confused them for a long time, were these headbands, that the people on board this craft wore these headbands. And they tried them on themselves, and some of the guys got headaches, others had very strange visions when they put them on. They might have put them on backwards or upside down or something. But apparently they had transducers in them, so that your thoughts could be, it could pick up your brainwaves kind of thing. And they think that that was connected to the actual control systems of the craft, so that what actually controlled the vehicle in flight was you'd think, all right, I'm going to go left, it would go left. Sort of thing.
Have you seen a movie called Firefox?
That's using that sort of idea. I haven't actually seen the movie, but I've heard about that. They said that the clothing that they wore was conductive as well. So the signal sort of went from the headband through the clothing to the floor of the craft, and that the entire craft was like a huge capacitor. So the creatures inside became sort of part of the circuitry.
Right.
And so their thoughts became part of the programming.
So they're like at one with the machine, in a sense. Gee,
very strange stuff. Fibre optics, though, were the only sort of connecting things that were found. And they didn't know what fibre optics were. We didn't have glass fibre optics in those days. They found that if they shone a very bright light in one end of this stuff that reminded them of a fishing line, that the light rays came out at the other end. That was a total surprise to them.
Lasers, I believe. Laser was one of the things they found.
Yeah, and that's another really interesting thing about this book. For years, researchers have been trying to connect the UFO thing with these cattle mutilation cases and stuff. Corso says that one of the artefacts that they found at the crash site was a small object, much like a torch, and it didn't work. You know, if you press the button, nothing happened. So he says, "Oh, I thought that, you know, obviously that the batteries were flat." But on a radio interview with Corso, I heard him say that when they were trying to work out what this thing was, they were in a laboratory where there was a bit of equipment that gave off a bit of radiation. And in the presence of radiation, this thing worked. So it was able to pick up radiation and then operate. And they found that it created a little red spot over the other side of the room. And no beam. They hadn't seen a laser before.
Right, so they had no clue what this was, obviously.
So in the late 1940s, they had a laser. Now, the discovery of the invention of the laser wasn't released, wasn't made known until 1960. And you know, the thing was like a metal machine shop lathe that was huge. It weighed tons. It wasn't a little handheld thing like what we have today. And what Corso says is that he knew when he was at the Pentagon, there were reports coming in of these cattle mutilations, and that was in the early 60s.
With these laser-like cuts.
Yeah, and he said that he knew that it must have been the extraterrestrials that were doing it, because they must have been using these laser things, that he had one of them, you see, one of the laser things. So he said it was obvious to him that it was the extraterrestrials that were doing the cattle mutilations. Now that in itself is a major breakthrough in UFO research, because for so long people have been saying, oh, there's no connection between UFOs and cattle mutilations. Corso says there's a direct link.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing, because I mean, along with, is it Major Marcel's son, this gentleman, there's quite a few reasonably high up military people or people who are somehow related to Roswell that are saying that this occurred, and they have so much credibility as individuals that their words also have credibility. How do you think that fits in with the denial of the US government? I mean, does he offer a reason for the US government denying Roswell ever occurred? Or that it occurred, but it wasn't a mysterious thing?
He puts it in terms of very few people ever knew about it. It was very well covered up at the time. The cover-up seemed to work, and it worked very well for a long time. A lot of people were silenced, but very few people were allowed to know about it. And only he and his boss, Trudeau, knew anything about what the files were and where they were. They just kept it all very quiet.
So MJ12 didn't exist, or
Well, MJ12,
grew out of it?
he doesn't call it MJ12. He calls them the working group, but they definitely did exist. They're the same names. He mentions the same names as you see in the lists that other researchers have come up with. But he doesn't call them the MJ12 or the Majestic 12. He just calls them the working group.
Yeah.
But they were a group of scientists that got together to try to sort out what was happening. But he makes it very clear what happened. The MJ12, when they did exist, only existed for a short period of time. It was a crisis that happened. They formed as a result of that crisis, and very soon after that they split up because they still had their major roles to play in their own division of the Defence Department, whether they were Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever.
They couldn't just throw their jobs away and concentrate on this thing.
So Nathan Twining divided everything up. The bodies, for some reason, went to the Navy, right? The craft went to the Air Force, obviously, and anything that could be used for weapons or technology went to the Army, and that's where Corso was. Right? So they got things like the silicon chip technology. They didn't know what they were. He said they looked like burnt Ritz crackers, these silicon wafers, about the size of a Ritz cracker. Corso handed them on to IBM for analysis.
So
and then the solid state technology came out.
I mean, we've got a bit of footage that talks about the US government's position even today. Maybe we can run that footage and we can have a look at it.
It's pretty recent. And it gives their current view now. Okay.
All right, well, if we can run that footage and then we'll have a bit of a talk about it.
Of any kind at Roswell. 50 years after claims of alien sightings in the middle of the desert, Americans say witnesses actually saw defence tests and not spaceships.
In July 1947, people reported seeing alien bodies at a crashed flying saucer in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. 50 years later, the American government hits back at rumours of a cover-up with the Roswell Report, case closed.
We've reviewed all the relevant information and we have finished this and we're not going to revisit it.
The report says debris recovered from the desert back then was from a top-secret defence research project called Operation Mogul. Mogul used balloons and unusual-shaped devices to detect Soviet nuclear testing and missile launches. As for the alien bodies supposedly found in 1947, Colonel Haynes says witnesses are confusing the bodies with dummies used in different tests, even though those tests were staged almost 10 years later.
I'm afraid that's a problem that we have with time compression. I don't know what they saw in 47, but I'm quite sure it probably was Project Mogul. But I think if you find that people talk about things over a period of time, they begin to lose exactly when the date was.
UFO enthusiasts aren't convinced.
So you're essentially saying people are idiots. They can't recognize mannequins from real-life human beings.
The US Air Force may have rejected the conspiracy theory, but that doesn't deter residents of Roswell, New Mexico, who are gearing up to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the alien sighting. And with unidentified flying objects still being sighted in US skies, most recently over Arizona in March, the Roswell Report won't close the alien case for everybody. Michelle Stone in the United States for 10 News.
Brian Keith.
Now, that's a really interesting report. Thanks for Channel 10 for that. Clearly, what that UFO researcher, I'm not sure who he was, said, that they must think we're idiots, is quite an accurate comment. I mean, the idea of time compression, the reporting of bodies in 1947 and then Project Mogul not happening until 10 years later, that's a pretty extraordinary position for the government to hold.
Well, it's a little bit like the position of the American skeptics that are purporting this theory that the Hills were influenced by a TV show that hadn't gone to air yet.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of logic. It just doesn't make any sense when you really look at it.
Yeah. And I mean, this gentleman here is amongst a group of fairly respectable ex-military people who are coming out and saying, yes, it happened. What does he say about the politics behind it? Like, what is our relationship with this race called the Greys? Are we friends with them, enemies of them?
All he says is that from a military perspective, it was seen as a military crisis when this thing happened, simply because it was so soon after the end of the Second World War, the Cold War was happening. But it was the behaviour of these things. When Roswell happened, it wasn't the first time they'd seen these UFOs. These flying saucers is what they were called then, and flying saucers were seen all around the world, but they'd been seen hovering around military places like the White Sands rocket proving grounds and places like that. They were seen regularly. They'd come in and look around it and take off very quickly, and that was seen as a hostile kind of behaviour.
Right, have you got some articles there that show some of this?
Yeah, well, so because of that, it was seen as a crisis, and so it was treated as a military threat.
Right.
And so because of that, they decided they would get all of this technology, now that they found it at Roswell, and engineer it and see if we could copy it so we could defend ourselves, because they were seen as a threat. But it was happening all around the world. What I did a few years ago, first of all, when this broke, on the back page of this book, you see this article here from the Roswell Daily Record about the flying saucers. Here's a bigger copy of it here. That date that happened was Tuesday, July the 8th, 1947. I had a look at our newspaper reports to see. I wanted to find out if anything on Roswell actually got to Australia. Yeah. And I looked at July the 8th, 1947. Yeah. And what I found was, well, there's the Herald. Now, on that very day, on the Herald newspaper, at the front page, it says Sydney sees saucers. It says that people in Sydney saw flying saucers going over. All right. Also that they were seen in Denmark as well, and that there was a reward out for people. If anybody could capture a flying saucer or a part of it, there was a reward offered as well. So it was in the news. Now, that's July the 8th, 1947, the same day that the Roswell thing happened.
So we're talking a worldwide phenomenon.
That's the Herald, right? The front page of the Sun as well. Oh, that's an earlier one. July the 8th, 1947 again. Now, this is on page 2 of the Sun. There's a report here about an airman's vain chase. After an airman chasing the flying saucer, it got away too fast. And that includes a notice from the departments of the Army and the Navy and that saying, well, they're not our vehicles that are getting away from you.
Really? So they were acknowledging that...
Yeah, it's nothing we've done. It's not any of our tests. Right. We're sending planes up to chase these things and we can't catch them. Yeah. So that's an admission of that. And that's on page 2 of the same day. The Sun, Tuesday, July the 8th. That's from the Sun. Right. Airman's vain chase after flying saucer. Right. That's that one there. There's also the Age for the same day, July the 8th. Front page again. Jet planes to join saucer hunt. Yeah. The Army Air Forces have added jet planes to the force of standard fighters which are standing by in the hope of chasing and explaining the mystery of the flying saucers, which have intrigued the country for 12 days.
For 12 days?
Yeah.
So for the US military to say today that it was just a Project Mogul that happened 10 years after and was only happening in the US, completely flies in the face of worldwide reports of the time.
Yep, they haven't looked at their own newspapers. Now, July the 7th, 1947, Flying Saucers Mystify. Yeah. Flying Saucers Mystify. That's another Melbourne newspaper. Right. A report from overseas. It's just full of them. There's another one, Flying Saucers in Sydney, another one. Yeah. It's just full of them. I was really surprised. I was gobsmacked. I didn't expect to see so many reports of it. Yeah. All front page news reports.
Now, getting back to the book, does he makes a pretty bold statement, it seems to me, which is that the reason that he's able to talk about this without any freedom of information restrictions on him is because we've won the war against Greys, or are able or in a position to defend ourselves now?
Yeah, and that's what he says. 2 major reasons why. One, because he had an agreement with his boss, who was Trudeau. His boss had an agreement with him. Once Trudeau passed away, then he'd be free to release the information. Trudeau died 3 years ago, and over the last 3 years, Corso's been getting this book together. So he says he hasn't broken any agreement that he had with the American government. The agreement was, when I die, you release the information. He died, the information has come out. And secondly, he says, our children have a right to know that we've been visited by extraterrestrials, that they've been here, that we have their hardware, their technology, that we've duplicated it, and that we use it in defence. And the main reason, he says, is because we've won the war. We can now defend ourselves against them. Because when this first happened, it was a shock. And we had no defences against them.
So it made sense to keep it secret.
Yeah, and now it's no longer a military secret because it's part of our defence system. That's basically what he says.
Wow. Has he copped any flack from the US government or anything since the publication of this book?
Not that I'm aware of, and he has been asked on radio programs whether anybody's had, tried to silence him or anything, and he says no, he hasn't. He maintains that he hasn't broken security at all. He's just maintained the agreement that he had with his boss in the Pentagon.
Yeah, and he's endorsed by, in fact, a senator, I believe, in the forward as being an honest and trustworthy character, as well as a long, distinguished military career.
Well, that particular senator also was a friend of Trudeau, who was Corso's boss, but he wasn't really fully aware of the nature of the book when he gave that endorsement, and he was quite upset afterwards, apparently.
Really?
He wasn't really expecting the beans to be spilled,
as
they were.
Tough luck to him, I reckon.
Tough luck, yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, George, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks once again for coming on. We'll see you next time.
Yep.
Also, if anyone wants to get in contact with VUFAS, what is it? PO Box
43 Moorabbin.
PO Box 43 Moorabbin. That's the latest publication. If you want to have a
we're on the internet as well.
Yep, on the internet. What's your internet address?
Oh,
www.
Tony? Aussie Mail. Yeah, it's Viewforce. Yeah, aussiemail.com.au. Viewforce.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So if you want to get in contact with George or any of the committee at VUFAS, they'd love to field your questions. All right, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, and stay tuned for more Local Vision programming. We'll catch you next week. Good night.